Hello again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This event will be recorded. My name is Pasiganto Vivo, and I'm a senior implementation specialist working on adaptation and climate finance, and also director of the Climate Analytics Lomé office, which covers climate analytics activities in the Africa region. And I will be your moderator for today's event. Climate Analytics Lomé office supports countries in low carbon development strategies, adaptation planning processes, and also negotiations and climate finance mobilization. We are very glad to join our colleagues of Climate Analytics Berlin and New Climate Institute in the Climate Action Trackers Governance Series analysis. I have here with me today from the Climate Analytics side, Deborah Ramalopi, who leads the climate policy team, Claire Stockwell, senior policy analyst, and Kofi Kumasi, who is an implementation specialist based in the Lomé office. On the New Climate Institute side, we have Maya Moizio, who is a climate policy analyst working on the Climate Action Tracker. We also have colleagues in the background that will provide in due time answers to questions during the Q&A. Next slide. Today, we aim to keep this presentation to around 30 minutes. Deborah is going to kick things off with a brief overview of the state of climate action post-Glasgow and what needs to happen in 2022. Maya will then share the spotlight on how well countries in the MENA region are doing. Claire will walk us through the importance of climate governance in attaining climate action. And Kofi, our last presenters, will close out the presentations by highlighting the main findings of the climate governance analysis that we realized for Egypt as the host of the MENA scope, as we all know. Next slide. Before I hand it over to Deborah, I would like to remind a few housekeeping matters. This event is being recorded. The recording and our slides will be made available on the CAT website. Following the presentations, we will have a Q&A sessions. To submit a question, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentations. There's no need to wait until the Q&A session starts. We will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. And to avoid having multiple channels open, we have disabled the chat function. If you are encountering technical difficulties, please also use the Q&A function, and we will try our best to resolve the issue. With all that said, let's begin. Deborah, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Kosigan, and hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us. As Kosigan has indicated, I am going to give you an overview. This is a brief summary of basically that shows where we are in terms of all the commitments and submissions that we have seen in the form of NDC targets or in the form of net zero targets. Next slide. So starting with this slide, if you look at the map here, the map shows the latest developments in terms of NDC updates. As you can see, the majority of countries have updated their NDCs. But you will also see when we get to the next slide that it's still not taking us to a 1.5 pathway. So in terms of the updates that we have, they basically range, it's a wide range of different updates that we have seen. They range from those that move a little bit and those with stronger targets, but we are still not seeing 1.5 aligned targets. And we also see that some of the targets, NDC targets, are a little bit much more ambitious than the previous one. However, the policies have not been improved. So you find that the policies are also not aligned to 1.5. But you also have, you look at the table at the bottom, there is a category of countries that have clearly unchanged targets, that have not changed the previous targets. They have just presented it as per the first, or similar to the first NDC. Next slide. This slide shows emissions gap in summary. So what it's basically showing is that the gap is narrowing, but still requires significant effort by governments. So it's a tiny movement in terms of closing the gap. In order to keep 1.5 alive, we need to have emissions. Some of you may know that we will need to have emissions by 2030. So where we are today is that all the NDCs that have been submitted thus far are basically are reducing the gap by about 15 to 17%. If you look at the graph at the top, you can see the difference of about 15 to 17% there. And this is basically a comparison of this analysis that we did before the COP that was released at the COP. If you go into the CAD website, you will get the details, or Climate Action Tracker website. And we compared that to our previous analysis, which was undertaken in September 2020. And the gap between the two shows a 15 to 17% improvement, basically. And if you look at the bottom right graph, this one shows the contributions made recently in terms of those that have contributed to this narrowing of the gap and the amount of emission reductions that the countries have contributed or submitted or announced or made commitments on. Next slide. Looking at net zero targets, this slide basically gives you a summary of net zero targets. I'm sure we have all seen a lot of net zero targets, countries committing to 2050, net zero targets. We have done an analysis in the Climate Action Tracker. And then in summary, around 90% of global emissions are covered by all the net zero targets that we have seen. And then you will see in the next slide that even with all these NDC net zero targets that have been announced or commitments that have been made by countries, we're still not going into the 1.5 world. So in the Climate Action Tracker, what we do, we evaluate the design of net zero targets. So we don't look at the adequacy of the target, we look at the design elements. And we evaluate those basically looking at the scope, architecture, and transparency of the net zero targets that have been submitted, what we basically call good practice of net zero submissions. And the design elements, when we look into those, we look at things like the emissions coverage. Does the net zero target cover all the greenhouse gases, or is just a selection of a few? That's just one example. The other example of the design elements that we look into as to whether the net zero target has been embedded into legislation or not. And there's about 10 criteria elements that we look into. If you go into the Climate Action Tracker, you can get the details of those. And what we have assessed is that based on this criteria that we use to look at the design elements, only 4 countries of the 40 countries that we cover in the Climate Action Tracker, covering basically around 6% of global emissions, have what is deemed acceptable in terms of the criteria that I've just outlined earlier. With the majority of countries having shared incomplete information, in that case, then we cannot assess them, or they have just submitted a poorly designed net zero target. And as I've said, this does not go into the details of whether there is any alignment between an NDC target and a net zero target or the adequacy of the net zero target. It's purely looking at the scope, architecture, and the transparency of the target submitted. Next slide. So what this slide basically shows, this thermometer is basically a summary of everything that I've just said. All these commitments, all the submissions, what do they mean? Where do they take us? And that's including everything, NDC targets, net zero targets. So the targets for 2030 are still inadequate. So despite all the recent updates submitted towards the end of 2021, we saw a lot of activity towards the end of the year last year, with many countries rushing to submit their updated NDCs or submitting their net zero targets. However, these are still not adequate to take us to 1.5. The 2030 targets only lead to end of century warming of about 2.4 degrees Celsius. And this assumes that all the targets that have been submitted will be fully implemented. And this is purely looking only at the 2030 targets. We have also looked at the best case scenario, what we call the optimistic scenario here in the graphic. This assumes that all announced targets will be implemented. And by all, I mean announced NDCs or net zero targets included in that calculation. And this lands us at 1.8 degrees Celsius by end of the century. So even if you add everything, the best case scenario of what we have currently, commitments from governments, it's still not taking us to 1.5. It's only taking us to about 1.8 degrees Celsius by end of century, which is a concern. And then the West performing its policies and action. So we also do an estimate of policies and action by governments. And then we have estimated that the current policies that have been committed by governments are being implemented are only taking us to 2.7 century. And this also shows the lack of alignment in targets government make and policies. So there is no alignment between policies and targets. As you see, policies are taking us to 2.7, and then the 2030 targets are taking us to 2.4. Next slide. This is a summary of the new sectoral initiatives. We also did an assessment of what was announced at the COP26. There's a few initiatives that were announced, and some governments signed up to those initiatives. And in terms of closing the gap, we have done an evaluation as to how much they contribute to the closing of the gap, and they add an additional 9% in closing the gap. So additional to the 15 to 17% that I spoke about earlier, if these initiatives were to be implemented, they will close a further 9%. And this is the likely impact based on those that have signed as of the 10th of November 2021. So this does not include anyone who has signed after the 10th of November 2021, or the potential impact that could be there when you have some of the bigger or larger emitters could sign up to these initiatives, and not only signing up to the initiatives, but implementing them. And I think that also applies to the targets that we have seen, that all this will only be effective and show real results if governments were to also implement relevant policies that are going to reduce emissions. I'm going to end here and hand over to Mia.
Thank you, Deborah, and hello from my side also to all the participants. I will now be giving you a short overview of the state of climate action in the Middle East and North Africa region by giving you an introduction, a snapshot of the country assessments that we do at the Climate Action Tracker for MENA countries. So a couple of words of introduction. We do in-depth assessments for 40 countries, 41 as of today, as we have just added Egypt to our list. And if you go to the next slide, please. Here you can see the assessments in the MENA region that we have conducted so far. So these are Morocco, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And if we sort of look at the wider Middle East, I mean, there you would include Iran, and then we also have an assessment for Turkey, which I have not included here. And so I will be focusing on these 4 countries, as you can see. So here you can see a snapshot of the overall ratings that we give to these 4 countries. And as you can see, it's quite a heterogeneous group of countries in terms of the ratings that they receive, starting from Morocco, which rates almost sufficient under what it should be doing for the Paris Agreement, and going down to Iran, which gets an overall critically insufficient rating across the board. And I will not be focusing too much on Iran, but just to say a couple of words here, Iran is one of the only countries in the world that has not yet ratified the Paris Agreement. And so it still has only an INDC that has been submitted, but no official NDC yet. So I will not go into too much detail, but for the 3 other countries, we've seen some positive developments over the past year and a half. And this has been, as for all countries, the invitation to submit new NDCs, and Morocco, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia have now all submitted updated nationally determined contributions, so updated climate targets under the Paris Agreement. So that's, of course, a very positive sign. And you might be wondering why is Morocco getting such a good rating? One of the positive things that Morocco did when it submitted its last updated NDC was to increase quite a bit the ambition of its targets. So now the overall emissions reduction, so the last update reduced overall emissions by 20% compared to the previous submission that Morocco had made. And with that, Morocco now gets a 1.5 degree Paris Agreement compatible rating for its policies and actions, and also for its unconditional target as submitted under the Paris Agreement. If Morocco were to slightly improve the ambition of its conditional target, so the target under which it receives international support, Morocco would be very close to getting an overall 1.5 degree compatible rating, which no country at this stage has received under the Climate Action Tracker ratings. And as some of you might, many of you probably know, Morocco is quite a leader when it comes to things like renewable energy investments in the MENA region. It has, for example, the highest installed capacity for wind energy in the region, just ahead of Egypt, and it is also making big investments in some other renewable energies. Now, one thing, well, a couple of red flags to mention here is that Morocco's electricity production is still heavily reliant on coal. And as we know, coal needs to be phased out to be compatible with the Paris Agreement globally. So that's something where we hope to see developments going on in the future. And Morocco is also one of the few countries that we assess under the Climate Action Tracker that has not announced a net zero target yet. So we hope to see some developments on those fronts going into COP27. Then the next in our list here is the United Arab Emirates. And as I mentioned, the UAE also, they were actually one of the first to submit an updated NDC back in December 2020. And they used to only have a clean energy target, but with the update, the UAE now has an emissions-wide, an economy-wide emissions reduction target, which is of course a very significant step forward. And along with Morocco, the UAE is also a major leader when it comes to renewable energy investments in the region. It pushes far above its weight for being a relatively small country, and it has the highest installed capacity for solar energy, for example, at 2.5 gigawatts as of 2020. So those are all very positive developments, but the UAE would need to do more when it comes to its fair share contribution under the Paris Agreement. So we would need to improve still its NDC target to receive a better rating under the Climate Action Tracker. Another similar red flag that we see similarly to Morocco is that the UAE is actually planning new investments into coal-fired power plants, and its 2050 energy target still foresees a major role for coal-fired power. So that we hope that the UAE will be the next COP host after Egypt, and so we hope that as part of that process, then there will be also some decisions made, perhaps on a coal phase out or a strengthened NDC also. And then the final one that I will present from these countries is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia also was the last from the list to submit a new NDC at COP26 last year. And this was, of course, also a step in the right direction. But here I should note that there is still quite a lot of uncertainty about Saudi Arabia's submission because the business as usual scenario on which the emissions reduction target is based has not been communicated. So there is quite a large range of uncertainty also in our assessment. Saudi Arabia has recently started to invest more in renewable energy, and it has very ambitious targets also for renewable energy. It hopes to generate 50% of its electricity with renewables by 2030, but the developments on the ground have been much too slow to meet this target. And as of 2019, less than 1% of electricity was generated with renewables. So some developments still to be made. on that front. And here I should also mention the UAE and Saudi Arabia did both announce net zero targets. So that is of course a positive step, but for both countries, we at this stage have no further information on these net zero targets. So we hope that in the lead up to the next COP, there will also be some further details on these net zero targets. So these are the assessments that we had up until today under the climate action target for the MENA countries. And if you go to the next slide, I will now be introducing you to our newest assessment, which is our country assessment for Egypt. We of course thought it was important to be able to say something about the next COP host. And so we've just published this assessment today. Egypt gets an overall highly insufficient rating. And here I should note a couple of points. Egypt is one of the countries that has not yet updated its NDC. So we still have the NDC that it first submitted in 2015. And Egypt is also one of the few countries that we assessed that has no quantifiable emissions reduction targets. And so we hope, of course, that in the lead up to the COP, Egypt will be submitting a new NDC with a quantifiable emissions reduction target, which we could then use to update our assessment. And Egypt is not very far. I mean, if it were to submit a new NDC and to get a 1.5 degree Paris Agreement compatible rating, it would need to, under the fair share component, roughly stabilize emissions at today's level by 2030. And so under the other component that we rate, the internationally supported targets, so the conditional NDC, the NDC with support from the international community, Egypt would need to roughly reduce its emissions by 25% below 2030 levels to get a 1.5 degree compatible rating. So we hope there will be a more ambitious NDC submitted soon that we can analyze. In terms of its policies, renewable energy investments and other investments related to decarbonization technologies have picked up in the last years in Egypt, but I should mention here that these are still small compared to investments that are going into fossil fuels and particularly the development of natural gas in the country. And with this, I would then close our overview of the MENA countries under the Climate Action Tracker, and I will hand over to my colleague, Claire, who will introduce you to our governance assessments. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Mia. Yes, so as Mia and Deborah have been outlining the sort of core of the CAD analysis, are country level assessments, rating and tracking countries' targets and actions, and then looking at what that means in terms of the global picture, the emissions gap to 2030 and end of century warming. But we know that especially, you can set the perfect targets. If we got 1.5 degree targets across the board, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that those targets are actually going to be implemented and achieved. So what we wanted to do, or what we started to think about doing is how could we add these other elements to the tracker? And maybe just a brief sort of introduction of that point. What I'm showing up on this slide is the history of the Climate Action Tracker's estimates for the past decade. And while you can see that the temperature estimate for either where our targets are going to get us or where policies are going to get us have been declining in recent years, which is of course a positive step forward, even if it's not fast enough and where we need to be, you can also see there that there's that gap between the targets that are on the table and the policy implementation, which Deborah was talking about in her presentation. So we really wanted to come up with a framework to assess sort of all of these other elements that could be relevant in the policy development and policy implemented setting. So back in 2018, we started to think about how could we do that in a way that was also replicable across a large number of countries, because as Mia outlined, we tracked 41 countries now in the Climate Action Tracker, and we try and keep those assessments updated on a fairly regular basis. And so what we did there, or what we were trying to do, is look at really what would be the indicators that we thought would be relevant to really support that policy development and implementation progress to make sure that the countries were in a position to meet the targets that they put forward and to achieve the transition to net zero. And of course, that's a very interesting question. So what are the relevant indicators? Because of course, no one has in fact transitioned to net zero. So you're trying to analyze something sort of ex ante before we actually have a lot of the research that's out there. And maybe a couple of indicators that are very relevant and very important in one country turn out not to be so relevant in another. So of course, trying to pinpoint the exact indicators is obviously something that needs constant revision as new research comes out, but we do think that there is sort of sufficient information out there, either in the literature or from our own experience, because both organizations also work in other forms outside of the CAD with governments on implementation, to try and identify at least a suite of indicators that we thought would be relevant for the transition. And maybe not all of those indicators are equally important in every single country, but our basic thought process was that the higher that a country scores on the more indicators is sort of more representative, that it's more likely that they would be in a position to transition to net zero rapidly and to ensure the necessary policy implementation to meet the targets that are on the table. So what we did was devise a national, focusing on the national level, because that's really where the CAT largely, especially in the country assessment, focuses on in the most part. Looking at the national level, we reviewed the literature and our own experience and came up with 28 indicators that we thought would be relevant for the transition, broadly divided into 4 categories. So looking at the political commitment that governments have towards the transition, whether they've set up the institutional frameworks that they need within governments, so that various elements of governments are talking to each other and working well together to implement the necessary policies, as well as the policy development processes and whether they're doing the sort of long-term planning and pathway development, and finally stakeholder engagement. And across, so that's the indicators breakdown in those 4 categories. And I won't go through each of the indicators individually because we're pressed for time, and I do want Kofi will present to you and go into a little bit more in depth our assessment of Egypt in a minute. But I thought, just so that you sort of understand how the framework works, I'd walk through one of them. And so if we look at, say, the policy implementation process, and there look at, for that, we thought that we broke that down into sort of 3 relevant categories or criteria, being the, is there a Paris defined pathway that a country has developed? Have they passed the necessary legislation? And then are they doing the backcasting from this long-term pathway that they have developed into short-term policy assessments? And then we would, going one down further, if we focus just say on the legislative piece, we then for each of those developed a bunch of indicators and then broke them down into benchmarks. And so we score for each indicator, we have a 5-point benchmarking system that we score countries on from very poor to advanced. And then we take all of the scores at the indicator level and then aggregate them up into the criteria and the category level. And that's what we develop the scores that you'll see in a moment into ranking the various categories and criteria. So that's the framework in a very short introduction. We do have a very detailed methodology note that's available on our website, which I would refer you to if you'd like to know further information about the framework. And then what we do is we score all of the score all of these indicators and then write them up into a detailed country profile, which just goes through each of the 4 categories, a narrative assessment, working off the scores that we've developed. And so that's what we published today for Egypt. But we've been trying to slowly expand. It is a more sort of research intensive and more qualitative than the other work that the CAT does, focusing on the country level in terms of emissions and target setting and the policy implementation side. So we've been slowly rolling it out to a set of countries over the past few years. And at the moment, we have about a dozen countries that we've managed to cover in the tracker. A couple of those we've actually been able to update, go back a year or so later to see whether there's been improvements in the governance framework over the course of the year. And we do have a number of others that are coming out in the coming months. So with that, I will turn it over to Kofi to give you an assessment of the Egypt case.
Thanks, Claire, for handing over the baton to me. Dear participants, my presentation will take you through the highlights of the assessment of the climate governance framework in Egypt and some key countries in Africa. But first and foremost, let me give you a little points as regard the methodology of this. The assessment that we have conducted in Egypt has been carried out through desk literature review, because we have contacted some officials in Egypt for some additional data, but they were not able to find time for the interviews. So as regards the results of the assessment, as you're looking at on the slides, it shows that that Egypt's existing climate governance framework is insufficient to make the country able and ready to transition its society and economy through net zero emissions. Because as you can see, out of the 4 categories, Egypt has shown some level of readiness only on the institutional framework category, whilst the 3 others have displayed limited level of readiness. Next slide, please. So going into details as regards each category of indicator, we are going to start with the political commitment indicator by saying that in the report, we recommend that to ensure that transition to a zero emission society is a priority for political leaders, because the assessment shows that Egypt's high-level decision makers are focused on the needs for climate adaptation and climate finance from developed countries to support resilience program, whilst not being strong advocates of the needs for transition. On another note, also, we have assessed the level of power of the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency, which is the lead agency on climate change in the country. And there we have noticed that actually the agency is constrained in bringing together and influencing all sectoral ministries to pay attention to low carbon development. Therefore, we recommend in the report the need to reinforce the power and the function of the agency in order to enable it play completely its role. And on the note of quality of decision of the government decision making, there is insufficient quality of government decision, because though there is incremental improvement in some new policies in the country, there have also been some significant rollbacks, and there is need for the government to ensure a proper continuity of the decision-making processes in the country. As regards the second second category of policy processes, we can see that the lack, which is the image at the right of the slides, the lack of strong political commitment leads to the fact that the Paris compatible policy development processes are highly insufficient in Egypt, because as mentioned previously by my colleague Mia in her presentation, from till today, Egypt has not adopted a net zero target, nor set a pathway to achieve low carbon development. And also the government of Egypt has not met the requirement to submit an updated NDC during the period 2020 and 2021. Though at the COP26, the president and the Minister of Environment have announced that there is an update and updated NDC in the works coming. So we hopefully that Egypt in the next coming months or weeks submit an updated NDC. Also at the COP, Egypt has announced the 2050 National Climate Change Strategy, which is a sign that climate change or transition to low emission development has started being considered in the policy framework, but we cannot, the strategy is not publicly available, and the few details that you have retrieved from its presentation mention no emissions target. On another note also, Egypt's near-term policies are not compatible to the Paris Agreement. If we take the example of renewable energy, the renewable energy target of the country is of 42% by 2030. However, a previous analysis conducted by Climate Analytics highlights that to decarbonize its power sector, Egypt has to have a high uptake of renewable energy in the order of 77 to 95% by 2030. We can see that, or we can obviously see that there is a huge gap between the actual energy target and what is required for Egypt to decarbonize its energy sector. And finally, on this point, we have noticed, or we have, as a result of the report, Egypt has not adopted a comprehensive climate-focused legislation, nor has it set up a legal and transparency architecture in the country. So the existing legal and transparency frameworks are fractured and piecemeal. Next slide, please. As regards the institutional framework, the assessment reveals some room of achievement that need, however, to be improved. Among others, the government of Egypt has set up a National Council on Climate Change, which is an interministerial body responsible for coordinating climate policy development and implementation across ministries and agencies. But the function and the mandate of this council has to be strengthened in order to play completely its role, because there are some policy development processes that are not in the field of this interministerial body. On another note, there is also a need to improve the level of mainstreaming the transition into government policies and to ensure proper alignment of sectoral policies and actions with existing and upcoming government mitigation strategies. In Egypt also, the knowledge infrastructure is somehow limited because the country or the government does not have an authoritative body with an explicit mandate to provide it with transition-related advice. As consequence, the country or the government relies on external advices, and there is some agencies in the country that can play this role, or that can play the role of advising the government. So there is a need to set up clear mandates for these agencies so that the government of Egypt can have an authoritative body that could provide it with advice in the process towards low carbon development. Finally, another important note, we can see that Egypt has a high level of climate finance readiness to mobilize adequate resources for climate actions. As example, in the MENA region, Egypt is the largest recipient of GCF funding. Egypt also is the pioneer of green bond issuance with the issuance of $750 million in 2020. Also, the country has a domestic climate finance system with the establishment of the Environmental Protection Fund since 1994. However, the country does not have a system that could tag, or through which the government could tag climate-related expenditures, and so the country is not able to track climate finance-related expenditures. However, there is positive sign because the government has started greening its public budgets. And in the category of stakeholder engagement, the assessment reveals that the engagement of stakeholders in the process to transition toward a zero emissions society is low, because though in the country it exists some mechanism to carry out consultations of stakeholders, but the level and the scope of these consultations need to be improved to ensure adequate public participation and proper buy-in in the policy decision making process. Also, in Egypt, the analysis have revealed that Egypt has not developed a comprehensive strategy to ensure a just transition and a green and to promote green jobs. So there is a call for the government to set up a clear, comprehensive strategy to let the transition to be fair to every Egyptian and to ensure that no one is left behind. So to conclude this part on Egypt, we can say that Egypt is getting prepared to host the next COP, which is the COP27 in November 2022. So with this opportunity, we hope that the government will very quickly ensure the improvement of its legal, institutional, and policy frameworks, so that the country could drive a transition towards a zero emission development in Paris Agreement compatible manner. Next slide, please. So as said on Egypt, we have also developed some assessments of some other African countries and around the world. So we are going to take some highlights of these three countries, which is South Africa, Ghana, and Nigeria. So I will not go through the report in depth. So I encourage all of the participants to go to the website to look at these reports and to read them to find the results of this assessment. But I will just mention 2 points here. The first one is, next slide, please. Yes, the first one is related to the level of government leadership in this three countries. So we can see that in South Africa, South Africa consistently ranked higher on this metric. But in the case of Nigeria, we can also, there has been a flurry of activity very recently. With, for example, the adoption of their climate change bill and the adoption of a net zero target, which could be an indicator of higher prioritization of climate issues in the country. So if, for example, we were to update the Nigeria report a year from now, we would hope to see that reflected in the scores. Sorry. For now, it is that reflected in the report itself, which is another reason why I could encourage you to go and read those reports. The second point, and next slide, please. It is related to the knowledge infrastructure. So we can again see here that South Africa has a history of commissioning robust research as the basis for climate policy. These include, for example, the 2014 mitigation potential analysis measures and also the policy and measure study in 2018. But as regards Ghana and Nigeria, as you can see it on the slides, they have entities that can play the role of being an authoritative advice body, as we can see it in the case of Egypt. But but those institutes or agencies are not the scope of climate-related issues in those countries. So finally, I will focus on gas in a number of these countries, meaning Ghana, Nigeria, and Egypt. So we can say that the CAT report has long said natural gas is not a bridging fuel. Continuing to invest can run the risk of stranded assets and a slowed expansion of renewable. But I will also mention it as a bit of advertisement in the reports of an upcoming report on natural gas that the CAT will be releasing in few months. So all these states, we encourage you to go on the CAT seat to read all the report that we have developed so that you can have clear idea on what is going on in CAT and climate governance series report. I will end here and hand it over back to Kwasigan for Q&A sessions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kofi and other colleagues for the presentation. That were really interesting, having like all the details and the assessments of some of the countries. So going back into running now into the Q&A sessions. Thank to all the attendees that have submitted a lot of questions. And thankfully, colleagues have been already answering live in the Q&A platform. But I still have a few questions that I would like to, in the matter of time, I would like to send to some of the colleagues in the panel. There is this question about how do we decide on which country to do the detailed level of analysis for. Claire, as you presented on some of the methodological aspects, do you want to take on this one?
Yes, thank you, Kwasigan. So, well, maybe I'll answer in the case of Egypt. Mia sort of indicated this in her remarks that we had thought there including them in the governance tracker would be, or in our governance series would be a good idea as they're in the incoming COP presidency, and that's also why we added them to the tracker. So when we look at new countries that we're adding, it's often because we either want to ensure greater regional coverage of the CAT analysis, or that maybe there's an upcoming significant moment like hosting the COP presidency. If we look historically at the countries that are in the climate action tracker proper, there we have tried to we cover all of the G20. We wanted to basically sort of cover off three metrics. One, that we were covering a majority of global emissions. So we have the G20 and all of the major emitters in there. We also wanted to ensure regional distribution so that we were covering the different regions of the globe. And then finally, that we would also have some sort of smaller, the negotiating blocks represented or lesser developed countries and small island nations and things like that. So that is the CAT proper. In terms of the governance series, that is, again, it's that regional distribution, it's a key moments, and it's also just listening to our stakeholders and trying to respond to stakeholder interest in terms of expanding the countries. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire, for those elements of answer. I would like to now maybe ask Deborah maybe to provide some element of answer on the question about how did you find the COP26 in terms of like impact on government approaches in climate change? As like one of the next question.
Thanks, Kwasigan. I think it's too soon to tell what the impact of COP26 is, but what I can say is that Paris has an impact. And I think in one of the slides that was presented, I think by Claire, that basically shows the impact that Paris has had ever since we've started tracking government action. You can see that there has been some movement. For instance, in 2015, ahead of Paris, we did an assessment of current policies. At that time, it basically showed that current policies were taking us to 3.6 degrees Celsius, and we are now sitting at 2.7. So there is some impact, although it's so slow, it's very slow. And I think governments really need to do more to make a meaningful impact and sort of help us head towards a 1.5 compatible pathway.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deborah. We see from the presentation that some specific areas, including like forestry and land use, like really highly insufficient in terms of like activity to reduce emissions. Do you have any recommendation for those particular sector? Maybe Maya, do you want to address this briefly?
Sure, thank you for the question. I should mention here, just to start us off, that at the Climate Action Tracker, when we look at countries' emissions, we typically show the land use sector and forestry emissions separate in our graphs, and we exclude those from our ratings because it's very important to also look specifically at what countries are doing to reduce their actual emissions, and then kind of on a separate note, it's important to look at whether the land use sector and forestry emissions are a source or a sink of emissions. So we look at that a bit separately, and we give a separate assessment of that usually in our assessments, and we do more in-depth analysis for countries where the land use and forestry emissions are indeed a big source or sink of emissions. And this links a little bit to another question we had about net zero emissions. I would also say that in net zero targets, it is also fundamentally important for countries to mention what, how much are they actually planning to reduce their emissions within their own borders, and also under what sectors, to what extent are they planning to use the land use and forestry sector as a sink or source of emissions. So that's one important point of transparency that all countries can contribute to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maya, for those elements of answers. So circling back onto the methodology, the process of running the CAT analysis, there's a question about to what extent climate litigation is an effective tool to strengthen climate governance, and also in the same rank of methodological question, there's also the aspect of how young people are actually involved in this process of the CAT analysis. I don't know, maybe Claire, you want to give it a shot?
Yes, just let me reshare the PowerPoint. Hopefully you can see all of that now. So maybe I'll start off with the stakeholder question first about youth. What I'm showing up on the slide here is how we break down the broad stakeholder category. We look at sort of three key criteria. So we look at the level that the government is engaging with the citizenry, and there we break that down into sort of how they're ensuring buy-in. So are they doing a number of stakeholder consultations? Are they then trying to take on board those recommendations that they're hearing from stakeholders? And then how are they trying to disseminate public education and build public knowledge and support for the transition? We then also look at the frameworks around just transition strategy, whether the government is sort of taking that into account. And then finally, we look at the non-state actor influences and how those are influencing on government here, both looking at actors that could benefit and that would benefit and that would also lose in the transition or have their interests at risk at the transition. And then also the ability, say, of the level of public support for actions, so the amount of pressure that the government is going to receive from the outside, and then also the level of capacity to a certain extent of those groups looking at the scientific literature. So in to the question on youth, we don't obviously in here have any specific category that's looking dedicated at youth, but obviously that would come up in a lot of places. So in the dissemination of public information in a lot of the reports, if you go into the profiles, we'll talk about activities that governments are taking to incorporate climate change into the curriculum and the extent that they're trying to improve youth engagement that way. Sometimes in the ensuring broad buy-in, you'll see that governments are holding sort of youth-specific consultation formats and things like that. And then also the level of public support that we tend to more assess through polling data, just because that's something that tends to be widely available across countries. But if there is something youth specific, it could also sort of come up in that realm. To the point on litigation, because we are really focusing on the national level, I think the litigation piece could be it could be an element that could put support from the outside on the government. So it may, for instance, if there was a lot of litigation, come up in perhaps the sort of public support indicator and come into the assessment that way, but we don't have, there's not a sort of dedicated indicator that we look at in terms of the amount of litigation in a country and what that impacts, also because the nature of litigation, there are so many there's so many different types, and the impact could be varied. So just having one indicator on litigation probably wouldn't. Yeah, it would be hard to tell you where the influence is. I mean, we do, for instance, in the Nigerian profile, we talk about some of the litigation that has been some of the around the corruption cases in the offshore oil drilling licenses and things like that. So we do occasionally discuss litigation in the report, but again, not a sort of separate bespoke indicator. And I think there was a third point that I wanted to ask on the general. And then I think someone asked something about, yes, tracking literacy and advocacy in the framework. Again, that would sort of be split either between looking at the dissemination of public education and knowledge, and they're looking at the elements of governments in terms of their curriculum. And then also in public support, we do, yes, rely on polling data, and they're trying to, if we can, if it's available, find polling data that also looks at sort of the level of climate literacy within a population. So looking at, how well does the population understand climate change? Do they think it's anthropogenic? Do they think it will have negative consequences on them? And then also looking, if that material is available, the extent to which the public supports particular policies and measures to actually cut emissions. So hopefully that covered a couple of birds with one answer. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Claire, for the element of answer. I think it was really useful to kind of like give us the overview and the implication of all those aspects. So we will take on the very last question because of time constraints. So I think my last question will go to Deborah, and it's about the existence of any resources about the expected health problems by climate change in the MENA region, for example.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So in the work that we have presented here, we do not take into consideration things like benefits, co-benefits, but this is part of work that we also look into in the Climate Action Tracker broadly. So if you go, we have a series called Scaling Up Reports. Our latest one is the Australian report, where we go deeper into what is possible per sector in each country. Unfortunately, we don't cover all countries yet. But there you can also see some of the benefits. For instance, what are the health benefits of basically moving from fossil fuels to renewables, as an example. But there's also multiple sources that we can share with you. I mean, we have an impact explorer that can also show you what the impacts are. If you get in touch with us via email, then we will share with you the links to those reports. Thanks, Kosika.
Yeah, thanks very much, Deborah. Now we are getting really to the very last stretch of this side event. But before we close, I would like to give 1 minute to each of the panelists to give briefly to provide us with like a key message before we walk out of the side event. And then we will start with Deborah again. Thank you.
Thanks, Kosika. I think the key message is simple and straightforward. It's that government needs to commit to more ambitious targets, and not only targets, but basically start implementing policies that are aligned to 1.5 pathways. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe heading to Maya.
Yes, thank you. One thing that I would say, and this applies to MENA countries, but also other countries in the world, is that we hope that we will be seeing many more updated NDC pledges as we move closer to COP27, and we will be responding to those as they come. So hope to see many also from the MENA region. And one thing that we did not talk too much about concerning the MENA region, as you all know, it's one of the main exporters and producers of fossil fuels. And with the whole world moving to net zero emissions slowly, I think that will also be a crucial sector to address in the coming years. So yeah, that would be my concluding words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. Claire Stockwell, if you can give us like a key message out of the side event. Thank you.
Well, unsurprisingly, and building on what Deborah said in terms of the importance of policies and the targets and policies to implement them, I would of course just add that you need, in addition to your building sector codes and planning your infrastructure for your charging stations, you also need all of the other governance elements to go with that, just to ensure that we can meet 1.5 degrees. So to always sort of have that in the back of your mind when you're thinking of the task that we have to tackle. But maybe if I can just also having an eye to a few of the questions that we didn't get to with the governance framework, what we were really trying to do was just add a level of detail, further detail to CAD analysis. And we will have, and we do try and do that across the board. So to the questions that we've had on the methane pledge and looking at sectors, that's another area and level of detail that we're looking to add. So please do watch our country assessment pages as those get updated throughout the year. We will have some new comments and tracking on the sectoral pledges from Glasgow available there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire. Kofi, maybe your final concluding words briefly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kwasigan. My last word will be this: President of Egypt has promised to the world an awesome Africa Cup in 2022. So our wishes is that this cup be also an opportunity for the country, I mean Egypt, to finally take steps into net zero development targets. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kofi, and thank you, everyone. We are currently at the end of our side event. I would like to remind every participant that recording and slides will be made available on the CAT website and sent to those who register. And also, as a final information, coming weeks, we'll see the publication of some of our CAT governance analysis for additional African countries, including Senegal and Rwanda. And on this, I would like to thank you very much for joining us today and see you next time.